June 4th, 1942, north of Midway Atoll, flag bridge of the carrier Akagi. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood with field glasses pressed to his eyes and felt the deck tremble through the soles of his shoes as the morning strike group reached engine warm-up. He had been grounded by illness and would not fly, yet he was still the voice that air officers wanted within reach when decisions had to be made in seconds. His world in that moment was metal, salt, and the fine vibration of power moving through a ship that was the pride of a navy built to fight with big guns, now led by aircraft that could range far beyond the horizon. He looked across a steel plain where Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu held station, their decks alive with deck crews and color flags, wheels chalked, wingtips pulled, torpedoes and bombs glinting in the new sun. The sea was almost flat, and the sky had only a thin line of low cloud to the west, the sort that hid nothing. Inside the glass housing of the bridge, the chart table showed tracks in grease pencil from the first scout reports, and the first order sheets had already been signed. He could smell hot oil that drifted from the engine rooms each time a door opened, and he could hear the staccato calls of the flight directors carried on from the island by voice tube and runner. He knew that across the water on the other carriers men were checking fuses with bare hands, that armorers were locking in bomb shackles, that pilots were settling into seats still cold from the night. He tasted bile at the back of his throat that he blamed on fever, and not on the worry that had sat with him since they left the home islands, the quiet suspicion that the plan was too clever for the sea. He remembered Pearl Harbor and the easy silence that followed the first strike, and he remembered the way that silence had vanished when the second strike had not been found. He told himself that this was not the same ocean and not the same enemy. He told himself that the commander-in-chief had promised the American carriers would be drawn into a trap and crushed by a line of battleships that had trained for a generation. He told himself that 4 first-line carriers in one body were enough to break anything that floated. He did not say aloud that he feared a simple thing more than any gun. He feared surprise. At the same hour, the wider war moved on a scale that no man on one ship could see. The Midway operation was the centerpiece of an enormous plan that stretched from the Aleutians to the Central Pacific, a plan born of confidence after 6 months of victory and based on ideas forged when battleships still set doctrine. The combined fleet sent more than 200 ships out of harbors from Kyushu to the inland sea. The Midway striking force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo carried 4 fleet carriers with about 240 aircraft, a fast battleship screen, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and oilers. To the north, another force attacked the Aleutians to draw attention away. Far to the west, the main body with the commander-in-chief, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, moved with battleships and additional carriers at a distance so great that radio silence and fuel calculations ruled every hour. The operation relied on a careful chain of reconnaissance and on a belief that the enemy would react slowly. What the admirals did not know was that American codebreakers working at Pearl Harbor under Commander Joseph Rochefort had read enough of their signals to fix the target and the timetable. Admiral Chester Nimitz placed 3 carriers to the northeast of Midway as a concealed striking force. These were Enterprise and Hornet from Task Force 16 under Raymond Spruance, and Yorktown from Task Force 17 under Frank Jack Fletcher, a ship that had been hammered at the Coral Sea only 3 weeks earlier and returned to service after a repair sprint that astonished even the sailors who worked in shifts to make her ready. On the atoll itself, ground crews had turned a coral strip into a hard-armed outpost, with Navy and Marine squadrons waiting, a thin shield. American strength in aircraft across the carriers and Midway came to a little over 300. Many pilots were young and green. Many navigators had never found a fleet at sea. What the Americans did possess was position to the northeast and an intention to strike first when an opening came. In the war rooms and map shacks ashore, the numbers already leaned toward a test of methods rather than metal. The carriers were now the core of both navies. The admirals of Japan had made them the sword that reached furthest, but the plan wrapped that sword in a set of assumptions that came from a time when gun lines decided outcomes. At 0430 by ship's time, the first order rolled along Akagi's passageways, and Fuchida felt the change in the air as men moved with a speed that came from practice. He watched the deck crews push Aichi dive bombers forward and the first Nakajima attack planes aft. He heard the launch order for a strike on Midway Island, not on the unknown carriers, and he understood why. The doctrine said to blind the enemy airfield before one sought his fleet. He saw the first wave lift into a pale sky and turn south, and he listened to them shrink into the distance over the rumble of Akagi's own engine note. He could not stop himself from counting off minutes until the report he most wanted to hear. Contact from the outer search arcs that would betray the location of the American carriers. In his head, he drew lines for scout planes that did not exist in sufficient numbers. He had asked for a stronger search pattern many times in many exercises. He knew there were not enough long-leg scouts run off the decks now because the carrier decks were full of strike aircraft loaded for a second blow against the island. He could see the carts of torpedoes resting under awnings in the hangar, safe by regulation, waiting for the word that would send them onto Osatsu, lift platforms and up to the deck. At 0600, a message arrived from the first wave leader over Midway that the runways still needed a second strike. The island batteries had not been silenced. Fires burned, but aircraft still rose. Fuchida watched the navigator bring the report to Nagumo and saw the admiral weigh it against an empty slate of enemy carrier positions. At that moment, the plan pulled in two directions. To strike the island again would reduce its threat to the fleet. To hold the second wave ready for a carrier strike would prepare for the decisive blow that was the reason they had sailed. The order that came at 0715 was to rearm the reserve planes for another attack on Midway. It was a human decision based on the information in hand. It was also the instant when time became the true enemy. Below decks, bombs and torpedoes began to move. Fuses came out. Fuel hoses ran. Armorer crews carried heavy shapes by hand under a ceiling as low as a man's reach. The smell of gasoline grew strong. Heat from the boilers lifted into spaces that had no breeze. Men worked with wrenches and latches in tight rows. Above, lookouts scanned a horizon that looked empty and harmless. And a neat stack of paper on the chart table waited for a scout report that could only arrive late. The larger frame that morning was filled with other men whose names would never be known to Fuchida, but whose actions would decide what he would see when the sky finally darkened with dots. Midway's early radar picked up the first Japanese strike inbound, and the island sent Marines into the air in planes that were already outdated. Many never came back. At the same time, the atoll launched torpedo bombers and B-17 bombers that tried to plant bombs from high altitude on moving decks. Bombs fell into white plumes of water. Torpedoes traced silver lines that missed. Losses were severe and would remain a scar in every squadron history. Yet every American launch forced the Japanese carriers to turn into the wind for recovery or landing or launch, forced them to keep their combat air patrol in a constant dance, forced them to adjust the clock by minutes that added up. Out at sea, the three American carriers launched their first waves between 0700 and 0830 from positions the Japanese could not see. The torpedo squadrons in particular drew the hardest task and the worst luck. The men of Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3, of Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6, and of Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 flew at wave-top height in slow lines, while fighters overhead could barely keep station. Many of those fighters were forced to turn back for fuel, and many never found the torpedo planes again. When the American torpedo pilots reached the Japanese formation, they met fast fighters and a wall of fire. Squadron 8 under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron pressed in without the fighter cover he had been promised. All 15 aircraft attacked, and only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived to float in the water and watch the afternoon with his own eyes. Historians would later write that those attacks failed. In a narrow sense, that is true. Not one torpedo struck home in those first runs. In the sense that matters to the shape of the day, the attacks took the Japanese apart. The combat air patrol was pulled down to sea level to kill the torpedo planes. The formations of the carriers opened as ships turned hard to dodge white wakes. The deck crews above the hangars waited for a word that kept changing with each new signal. Nothing launched. Everything exposed. At 1,000, the clock that had started ticking when the rearm order was given reached the point of no return. On the American side, 2 groups of Navy dive bombers had been circling in search patterns after long flights over empty water. The group from Enterprise under Clarence McCluskey and the group from Yorktown under Max Leslie found the Japanese by a mixture of logic, luck, and a single sighting of a lone destroyer at speed that told McCluskey which way to turn. At 10:20, the dive bombers arrived high overhead, while the Japanese fighters were still down near the sea, finishing the work of killing the last torpedo planes. From that height, a carrier is a square of brown and white, a target that seems to sit still until one starts down the slide. On Akagi, the first sign for Fuchida was not the sound of engines above because the ship was already a hive of noise. It was the sudden change in the voices of the lookouts as they spoke at once, then the sharper tone of the air officer. He stepped to the glass and saw far above a handful of tiny black flecks that grew fast into the blue, the shapes that anyone who had watched the raids on China and the raids on Pearl Harbor would know as dive bombers coming out of the sun. He felt the ship heel as the helmsman threw the rudder over, and he heard the officer of the deck order full speed. He saw red tracers reach up and then fall away as if tired. He did not know in that breath that Kaga and Soryu were being hit in the same minute. On Kaga, armorers had left bombs on carts that still stood on the hangar floor near fueled aircraft. On Soryu, crews were near open fuel lines. When the first bombs struck, their blast rolled through crowded spaces and turned airplanes into fuel-fed fires that ran along deck seams. Fuchida watched one dive bomber fall into the sea short, then saw another pull out hard and vanish behind smoke. He felt the shock of near misses. Then a single bomb from an Enterprise SBD fell toward Akagi. The ship tried to twist away, but the bomb struck near the aft edge of the flight deck and punched through into the hangar, where it found the mix of fuel vapor and armed aircraft that every safety rule in the book warned against, and that every urgent order had created. Fire did not start as a line. It started as a room filled with flame. It moved with wind from broken openings, and it fed on everything that made a carrier lethal. Fuchida looked down and saw men in white shirts run with hoses that looked like threads against the size of the flame. He saw one man throw a small pump with his bare hands to another. Then he lost sight of both in smoke so thick it looked like fabric. From the bridge wing he could see Kaga on a far bearing with a cloud that did not move. He could see Soryu pitching in and out of black curtains as if she were playing a cruel game of hide-and-seek with the men on her deck. Hiryu still stood off and would live a little longer. He tasted ash in his mouth and tried to drink from a canteen that had become hot to the touch. He realized then that the expertise he and his peers had built in 6 months of victory had been turned against them, not by a new weapon, but by a series of choices that had left them blind for 1 hour and exposed for 10 minutes. He could not have known the numbers yet. The count of aircraft destroyed before they could lift. The count of men on fire below him. The count of dive bombers that would land with empty racks on American decks and climb out of cockpits with hands shaking. He knew one number that mattered to a naval officer. They had lost the initiative in one turn of the glass. Across that midday, the larger war contracted to a single point where doctrine met reality. In the months before this day, the Navy of Japan had trained for a decisive battle in which fleets met, and the battleship line finished what scouts and airstrikes had begun. The admiral who commanded the force at Midway had been given a plan that assumed light resistance, that separated the parts of the fleet by hundreds of miles for a lure that never moved, and that placed the most precious ships of the empire under a rule of conflicting tasks. The American side was simpler. Nimitz chose to fight with carriers. He placed them where he believed the enemy must pass. He ordered his task force commanders to strike when they found a target and to keep striking. After the first blows fell, Hiryu tried to reverse the day. Her air group launched 2 counterattacks that found Yorktown, struck her, and made it seem for a time that the scales might level. Damage control on Yorktown contained the first set of fires and brought her back to life. The second attack hurt her so badly that crews could barely keep her afloat. Later, a submarine would send her under. Yet in the afternoon, the Enterprise and the battered Yorktown air groups found Hiryu and hit her as the others had been hit. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning or doomed. Over 200 aircraft were lost, and many of the most experienced aircrew in the Navy were dead or adrift. 2 days later, the heavy cruiser Mikuma would go down under bomb strikes, and her sister Mogami would limp away broken. The raw numbers tell only part of the story. It was not only the loss of hulls, it was the loss of trained men who could not be replaced fast enough. It was the revealed truth that the carriers were the center of naval power now, and that they could not be tied to a distant battle line or to a theory that did not fit the way the air war moved. In one battle, the admirals had shown how an old way of thinking could leave a new weapon naked at the worst possible moment. The men on the decks paid for that with their lives. The war would go on for 3 more years. Battleships would still fire in anger, and shells would still land on targets. But the nerve of the Navy now ran through flight decks and ready rooms. The weight of that reality fell on the sea near Midway before noon on a bright day when a handful of dive bombers arrived at the right altitude while the defenders were looking low. Flame climbed past the island structure and blew sideways in the wind that moved across the flight deck, while Commander Mitsuo Fuchida held the bridge combing with both hands and tasted the grit that came when paint and cable burned. The deck was a field of splinters where a single bomb had cut through wood and steel and found the hangar. He could not see the men below except when a blast blew a sheet of smoke clear for a heartbeat. Then he would glimpse a row of aircraft that had become frames, tire rims that glowed, and helmets that flashed as men crawled through pools of fuel that had caught fire. The air officer tried to bring order to hoses that lost pressure and valves that stuck. He shouted for foam, then for water, then for anything that would cool the steel underfoot. The captain ordered the ship turned so the wind would carry something of the fire away from the island. And the helm answered. And for a moment, the flame bent enough that Fuchida saw the far horizon. It looked peaceful, like any calm day in the Central Pacific. And he felt the sick knowledge that a ship could die in weather like that, without a single wave to blame. He steadied his field glasses and looked for Hiryu. She stood clear on a distant bearing, her wake white, her deck still workable. He carried that sight like a talisman for several minutes, because it meant one carrier could still strike. Then he forced himself to look back at Akagi and to listen as the messengers reached Nagumo with status from across the division. Kaga was a torch. Soryu was reporting fires from bow to stern and secondary explosions that ran along the length of her hangar. Akagi had lost steering on a straight course for several minutes, then regained it, which only made the crew watch the fires with a false hope, because the decks below were gone. Fuchida thought of the young men who had climbed into cockpits at Oita and Kagoshima and had flown with him over Pearl Harbor. He thought of the careful drills that had been done in winter light on the inland sea. He could not reconcile those images with the sound he heard now, a continuous roar broken by crackling reports as ammunition cooked off in racks meant for the next attack on Midway Island. He remembered writing in a notebook several months earlier that hangar, safety, would decide a war at sea more surely than any cruiser picket. He had underlined the sentence. It seemed prophetic now, and utterly useless. Away from the burning decks, a different kind of order began to form. It is hard to see this from the point of view of a single officer on a single ship, yet the record is clear. After the three first carriers were hit around 10:20 on the 4th of June 1942, Hiryu remained able to launch. Her captain Tamon Yamaguchi, a stern and exacting man who believed in strict standards for himself and his crews, chose to strike back at once. He had every reason to try. Reports from the combat air patrol and from the ships that watched the sky told him that the attack had come from dive bombers, which often flew without heavy fighter guard at the end of a long search. The counterstroke went out as two separate waves from the one carrier that could still act. The first found Yorktown a little after midday. The American carrier saw the attackers on radar, put fighters up, and turned hard while her gunners covered the sky with black bursts. The Japanese dive bombers came down through the fire and placed several bombs on Yorktown. Fires started and smoke blew out across the wake. The next hour became a test of American damage control that would be studied for the rest of the war. Pumps ran. Hoses snaked across the decks. Ventilation was shifted to starve flames of air. By early afternoon, Yorktown had restored enough power to make headway and recover aircraft. It was a display of organization that impressed even men who were trying to kill the ship. The second wave from Hiryu followed a little later with torpedo planes that turned low and came in from both sides. They placed at least 2 torpedoes into Yorktown on the port side and knocked out power again. This damage was fatal over time, even though the ship would remain afloat for another day. The exchange looked for a few hours, like a fight that could yet bend back toward a split decision. That is not what happened. In the middle afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise that had been recalled, redirected, and then sent on again found Hiryu as she tried to prepare another strike. They put bombs into her flight deck and into the spaces below. The fourth carrier to be struck was now in the same condition as her sisters. The number that matters is simple. By evening of the first day, all 4 first-line carriers of the Mobile Force lay burning or dead on the sea. On Akagi, Fuchida felt the deck cool under his feet, only when the flame had eaten the fuel that had pooled in the hangar, and when the wind had shifted slightly with the coming of mid-afternoon. Cooling did not mean safety. It meant the ship had passed from one kind of danger into another, which is the moment when men begin to consider whether a hull can be saved, or whether it has become a tomb that must be abandoned while there is still light. He moved with the group that carried messages to Nagumo, and stood close enough to Hear the Admiral when the captain explained that the fire teams had been driven back from the hangar by heat that had peeled paint and warped overhead beams. The magazines had been flooded where possible. There were still shells that could not be reached. Steering was uncertain. Power flickered. The flight deck had sections that could no longer bear weight. The voice of the captain was measured and calm, as if he had become the man that one always hopes to hear in a ship crisis. The admiration that Fuchida felt for that steadiness did not reduce his sense of loss. He asked for permission to go below and help direct the last effort to save aircraft that had been rolled back from the worst of the heat. The air officer who heard him shook his head and said there were no aircraft to save. The crew had pushed several into the sea to make room for fire teams and to remove fuel from the hangar. He walked to the bridge wing and looked astern. The flag still lifted from the staff, and a tug of something like pride pulled at him, but there was no denying the truth. The heart of the ship had burned out. In his memory later, he would set that moment against a different one in December 1941, when he had circled above Pearl Harbor and had watched Arizona explode with a column of smoke and debris that seemed to reach for the stars. He had believed then that a fleet could be broken in one morning if one controlled the sky. He had not truly believed the same could happen to his own force until he stood on a deck that had become a raft. Around him, men carried wounded on stretchers made from canvas and pipe. They handed canteens to sailors whose faces were gray with soot and shock. A cook with bandaged hands held a pot of water, as if it contained the last resource on Earth. A bosun offered a cigarette to a boy of 19, whose hair had been singed away. The boy tried to smile and failed. Afternoon light shone on everything with a kind of cruelty that no one would have noticed on a day without disaster. The captain ordered preparations to abandon ship. Boats were lowered. Lines were rigged. Men went over the side into the wake in controlled groups. Fuchida remained on the bridge until the last possible moment, because that was what a senior officer did. When he climbed down a line and dropped into the sea, he felt the shock of cold and the odd feeling of relief that comes when noise recedes. He turned in the water and looked back and saw Akagi as a silhouette with smoke still coming from vents and a patch of flame that ran along the edge of the flight deck like a ribbon. The strategic picture around him continued to shift during those hours, even if he could not see it from the surface of the ocean. Reports moved across sets that had been silent for most of the day. The commander-in-chief with the main body, far to the west, was informed of the blows and altered course to try to draw closer. The distance was too great, and the fuel state of many ships did not allow a reckless dash. Cruisers that had screened the carriers were detached to protect rescues and to threaten any American surface force that might appear out of the smoke. American commanders counted aircraft and crews and planned another set of strikes to reduce any chance of a night attack from the remaining Japanese force. Midway remained on alert against a surface bombardment that never came. By late evening on the 4th June, every surviving Japanese carrier aircraft that could reach a deck had done so on Hiryu before she was hit. The rest landed on the water or sought Midway and were lost. Many crew were recovered by destroyers that ran among oil slicks while keeping one eye on the horizon for American submarines. The night belonged to searchlights and small boats and the sound of pumps. At 0500 on 5 June, the crew of Akagi who had been taken off watched as a destroyer fired a spread of torpedoes into the flank of their ship to prevent capture and to end the risk that any final internal explosion might break her apart among men still nearby. The ship rolled and settled and went down. Kaga and Soryu were scuttled in the same way. Hiryu sank shortly after dawn on the 5th of June after a long night of fires. The final toll was heavy. The number of dead across the 4 carriers ran into the thousands. American losses were severe among the torpedo squadrons and included Yorktown, which would be finished by a submarine on 7 June while under tow. The outcome, however, had tilted the entire Pacific War. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and a corps of trained aviators who could not be replaced quickly. The United States had lost 1 carrier, many aircraft, and many brave men, yet possessed an industrial pipeline that would deliver new carriers and new air groups at a rate that no opponent could match in 1942 or 1943. The figures carry their own authority. American yards would produce dozens of new carriers and hundreds of escort carriers by the time the war ended. Japanese yards would never replace more than a few of the fleet carriers lost at Midway. When historians call Midway a turning point, they mean this arithmetic of men and steel, but they also mean a change in judgment. The battle made clear to every navy that the flight deck was the sovereign platform at sea. Fuchida was pulled from the water by a destroyer whose deck was crowded with survivors from several ships. He lay on a coil of rope and coughed until his chest hurt. A sailor handed him a cup of hot tea that tasted of smoke and oil, and it was the best thing he had tasted in months. On the far side of the deck, a wounded pilot kept saying the same sentence because shock had narrowed his world to one loop. He said that he had seen a dive bomber, and then there was light, and then there was nothing. And now there was this deck. Fuchida sat up and felt a deep weariness that years later he would describe as the feeling that comes when a man has looked over a cliff at his own past and knows that he cannot go back to the path he walked. He watched as officers from different ships compared notes and tried to shape a report that would be sent in clear language stripped of emotion. He thought of the admirals who had built the plan. He respected many of them, and he knew how much they had given of themselves to bring a navy from limited resources to a position of global reach. He also knew that respect for hard work does not protect anyone from the laws of chance and consequence. He had seen at Pearl Harbor how surprise and careful preparation could cripple a fleet in a morning. He had just seen how complacency about reconnaissance and an attachment to a sequence of strikes that looked neat on paper could blind men to the simple need to find the enemy and strike him first. He would write later that a plan should be like a map that has room for unknown roads. On Akagi, the map had been too narrow. He did not yet know that his own name would become associated with an account that tried to be honest about both courage and error. He only knew that the haze across the sea that evening felt like the end of one world and the beginning of another. He went down into the destroyer to sleep on the deck near the engine room because there was no room anywhere else. The pulse of the ship through the steel felt almost gentle after the violence of the morning. He slept. While he slept, other forces moved along lines that would set the shape of the summer. The Imperial Navy fell back from Midway and tried to draw the Americans into a night surface action east of the atoll. The chance never presented itself. Submarines watched the lanes and sent in contact reports. The American carriers withdrew to the east to preserve their striking power for the next month of operations. On Midway, men walked among wrecked aircraft that had used their last fuel for attacks that had seemed to fail, and now understood that those attacks had mattered in the way they had disrupted Japanese timing and placed fighters low. The Japanese army on the home islands and in China and Southeast Asia had to read communiques that spoke of carrier losses and that did not match the easy victories of winter and spring. In Tokyo, the press printed official statements that tried to soften the blow without admitting the size of the disaster. In Washington, the Navy Department released a measured account that praised the valor of the air groups and the steadiness of the commanders. When Admiral Nimitz visited Midway after the battle, he looked at the pitted runways and spoke to the men who had flown and to the men who had dug. He told them that they had done a great deed. It was not a flourish. It was a plain statement that matched the ground under his feet. In the months that followed, American industry would send out Essex-class carriers and Independence-class light carriers in a stream. Pilots would train at places like Corpus Christi and Pensacola, and then at forward fields on Oahu and Maui. Japanese training pipelines would try to keep up and would not. The Battle of the Solomons would require every lesson that Midway had offered. It would punish both sides, yet it would punish Japan more because the reserve of machines and men was smaller and shrinking. Near dawn, on 5th June, Fuchida climbed back to the destroyer deck and saw the sea with that special clarity that comes after a night of very little sleep. Men around him were silent in the way sailors are when they have lost friends and can do nothing but wait for orders. He remembered a sentence from a diary he had kept years earlier when he was a young officer on a smaller ship. He had written that the sea takes everything in the end, and that the only question is whether a man gives his best before that happens. He felt that the men on the flight decks had given their best. He did not feel anger. He felt the weight of a lesson. The Navy had built a sword that was unmatched at the start of the war. The Admirals had also kept one foot in a doctrine that required the sword to fit patterns that belonged to an earlier time. The pattern had broken at Midway. He did not speak in these terms to the men around him. He asked for news of Hiryu. He asked whether any of her air officers had been taken aboard. He asked about the fate of friends whose names he said one by one. He wrote several of the names on a scrap of paper, along with a brief description of where each had last been seen. He put the scrap in his pocket and later found that it had become a small paste of pulp and ink. He kept it anyway. That evening he stood near the rail as the destroyer steamed west to rejoin the remnants of the force. The sky was clear again. A small line of cloud marked the horizon. He thought of home and of the small routines that men cling to in peacetime. He thought of the boys who had left those routines for the promise of service and adventure. He promised himself that if he lived, he would tell the story of what he had seen. He did not mean a story that excused men who had made poor choices. He meant a story that set both courage and error before the reader without ornament. The destroyer that carried Mitsuo Fuchida westward joined the remnant of the 1st Air Fleet near dawn on 6 June 1942. The sea was glass smooth, a deceptive calm that magnified the loss. Fuchida stood on the afterdeck and watched as the horizon revealed only destroyers, cruisers, and a single battleship steaming in loose formation. Where 4 carriers had once filled the skyline, there was now open water. He felt the silence most strongly during the morning watch, when the fleet would ordinarily be alive with air operations. No engines idled, no deck crews prepared launches, no flag signals marked takeoffs. The machinery of the mobile force had been gutted in one day. He was taken aboard the battleship Yamato later that morning for debriefing with staff officers of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. On board the flagship, discipline held as always, yet everyone moved with the awareness that a new balance of power had begun. Fuchida sat in a small wardroom, his uniform salt-stained and smoke-marked, and gave his report in measured tones. He explained how the dive bombers had arrived overhead just as the Japanese squadrons were being refueled and rearmed. He described the chain of delays, scouts returning late, reports unclear, the decision to rearm aircraft for a second strike on Midway rather than hold them ready for an approaching enemy force. Yamamoto listened without interruption. His face was still, his pipe unlit. When the report ended, he asked a single question. Could any of it have been avoided? Fuchida thought for a long moment, before answering that the enemy had done what Japan itself had done at Pearl Harbor. Struck first with precision and surprise. The admiral nodded once, said, "So we have learned our own lesson," and dismissed him. Across the Pacific, the consequences began to unfold faster than anyone on Yamato's bridge could imagine. Midway gave the United States not just a reprieve, but an initiative it would never lose. In numerical terms, the blow was catastrophic for Japan. 4 carriers destroyed: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, over 300 aircraft lost, and roughly 2,500 men dead or missing. In the same 24 hours, the Imperial Navy had erased its advantage in carrier aviation. American losses were serious, but recoverable: Yorktown and 150 aircraft, but industrially replaceable within months. The Japanese shipyards at Kure and Sasebo could launch 1 new carrier every 8 or 10 months. American yards could turn out 1 every 6 weeks by 1943. Even before the fires on Akagi went out, orders were issued to accelerate construction of the Taiho-class carriers, but the steel, labor, and time required would not meet the demands of an expanding Pacific front. Strategists at the Naval Staff College later wrote that Midway compressed into 1 day the consequences of a decade of misjudgment. The Navy's obsession with the decisive battle theory, Kantai Kessen, had left it unprepared for a war of attrition and production. The admirals had built a navy optimized for a single climactic engagement. At Midway, they found that a single engagement could also end a navy's prime. Fuchida spent the following weeks in the sickbay at Yamato, his body recovering from burns and exhaustion. He listened to the wireless reports from the Solomons, where Japanese troops were still advancing, and tried to reconcile those victories with the loss of the fleet's striking arm. Letters from home reached him in July. His wife wrote from Yokosuka that the newspapers called Midway a glorious victory of spirit over material odds. She said neighbors hung flags, believing new carriers would soon avenge the losses. Fuchida folded the letter and placed it under his pillow without answering. He knew the reports were false. He also knew the wound. Government had no choice but to lie. In August, he was assigned to a liaison role in the Naval Air Command at Kure, where returning officers from the battle were gathered for analysis. Each man brought fragments of the same story: missing reconnaissance planes, conflicting orders, confusion on the flag bridge. When they assembled to recreate the timeline, the pattern became undeniable. The admirals had tried to command a carrier war with methods designed for battleships: tight formations, rigid communications, and an insistence on perfect coordination before attack. In contrast, the Americans had operated with decentralized command and flexible timing. Their doctrine allowed squadrons to strike as soon as the enemy was sighted. The difference in philosophy had been worth 4 carriers. In the meeting minutes later published internally as the Midway Assessment, one entry stands out. It reads, "Speed and initiative have replaced order and sequence as the conditions of success at sea." Beyond the walls of the Naval Staff College, the nation still spoke of victory. Radio Tokyo played martial songs about Pearl Harbor and the southward drive. Few citizens knew that the balance of power had turned against them. Fuchida's role became the education of new aircrews. He lectured on coordination, strike timing, and damage control. His words often carried an undertone of despair he could not hide. He told cadets that they must study enemy methods as carefully as their own and that technology without flexibility was a trap. The younger officers nodded politely, but many still believed Japan's spirit would compensate for losses. By late 1942, when the first reports came from Guadalcanal showing that the Americans were building airfields faster than Japan could destroy them, that faith began to fray. In December, Fuchida watched a new group of carrier pilots practice on a wooden mock deck at Saeki. He noticed how few instructors remained. Most of the veterans who had flown at Pearl Harbor or Coral Sea were gone. Training time had been cut to 6 months instead of a year. He wrote in his diary, "We are feeding the best of our youth into engines we can no longer replace." That sentence survived in the post-war edition of his memoirs, a quiet testimony to the awareness that had settled over the surviving officers even before 1943 began. In early 1943, the Pacific Ocean was no longer a Japanese lake. Supply convoys now moved under threat from submarines, and the once invincible air wings of the Imperial Navy had thinned to shadows of their former selves. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, still recovering from his injuries, was reassigned to the Naval Air Headquarters in Tokyo. His task was to help design new doctrines for carrier operations, an irony that did not escape him. He wrote in his notebook that every new rule seemed to be written on the ruins of the last one. The office smelled of ink and stale smoke. Staff officers came and went with files tied, in twine, each labeled with euphemisms like temporary setback or forward readjustment. Yet among them, the awareness was spreading that the empire could not win a war of production. The Americans were launching new carriers, Essex, Intrepid, Yorktown II, each carrying air groups larger than an entire Japanese division. Every month brought more Grumman Hellcats and Avenger torpedo bombers, while Japan's replacements were lighter, slower, and crewed by pilots whose training hours had been cut in half. The reports on Fuchida's desk told a story of exhaustion, written in numbers. In 1941, Japan had trained nearly 1,000 naval aviators. By late 1943, fewer than 200 met qualification standards. He stared at the tables one evening and thought, "We are fighting time itself." From his new post, he watched the Solomon Islands campaign unfold on maps and message traffic. Guadalcanal had become a graveyard for both sides, but Japan bled more heavily. The carrier Zuikaku, survivor of earlier battles, now sailed with a fraction of its original air group. Shokaku and Hio struggled to maintain operational tempo, their decks often half-empty because there were not enough pilots to fill the cockpits. When the Americans raided Rabaul in November 1943, the Imperial Navy attempted to intercept. The engagement lasted less than an hour. American aircraft attacked from ranges that stunned the Japanese officers, striking from beyond what their own doctrine had considered possible. The after-action reports filled Fuchida with a familiar chill. Poor reconnaissance, delayed response, confusion over radio channels, aircraft launched piecemeal instead of in massed waves. He had seen all of it before. At Midway, the cost had been 4 carriers. At Rabaul, it was the illusion of parity. By the end of the year, the Navy had begun recalling officers to Japan to plan for what they called the decisive homeland defense. Fuchida knew the phrase was another kind of denial. The winter of 1943 brought air raids to Truk Lagoon, the great anchorage that had once been Japan's forward fortress. When the American carrier groups struck it in February 1944, they destroyed or damaged more than 40 ships and hundreds of aircraft. Fuchida stood in a briefing room in Tokyo, listening to the teleprinter clatter as the messages came in. He remembered standing on Akagi's bridge 2 years earlier and realized that history had begun to repeat in shorter and shorter cycles. Each new defeat followed the same pattern: poor scouting, fragmented air defense, ships caught with fuel hoses still attached, aircraft rearming on deck. He tried to speak of it during a staff meeting, telling the younger officers that flexibility was the only armor left. The room went silent. One captain replied that spiritual discipline would overcome material odds. Fuchida said quietly that gasoline and gunpowder did not understand discipline, only physics. He was not invited to the next meeting. By summer, he was sent to the flight training center at Oita to instruct new cadets. The students called him Sensei Akagi behind his back, half in respect, half in superstition. He watched them struggle with maneuvers in outdated planes and knew that most would die before learning what real combat looked like. In the summer of 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea delivered the final proof that Japan's air arm had become obsolete. Fuchida followed it through radio intercepts and situation maps in Tokyo. On 19th June, American radar detected the Japanese approach hours before contact. When the first waves launched, U.S. fighters met them far from the fleet and tore them apart, an event later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Out of over 300 Japanese aircraft that took off that day, more than 200 were destroyed. Only a handful returned. The loss of trained crews was irreversible. Fuchida wrote in his diary that evening, "The sky we once ruled has turned against us." He knew that the outcome at Midway had not been an accident, but a symptom of deeper flaws: rigid command, inadequate intelligence, faith in luck and courage rather than data and preparation. The Admirals had built their own obsolescence brick by brick, doctrine by doctrine, until the Empire's most modern fleet fought like a relic of another century. For Fuchida, the realization carried both shame and relief. Shame that he had served a machine that refused to learn. Relief that the pattern was finally visible even to those who had denied it longest. He did not yet know that within a year, the carriers he had once helped to launch would be rusting hulks beneath American bombs, and that his own survival would depend on witnessing their destruction.